Hello and welcome to the third episode of Signposts, Arouca Press's podcast, where we delve into our books and contemporary issues with our very own authors. I'm Julian Kwasniewski, Assistant Editor and Marketing Director at Arouca Press. Today I'm happy to be hosting Dr. David Hajduk, Professor of Theology at Del Barton and Immaculate Conception Seminary. Not only professor, but also author and father, he and his wife homeschool their 11 children. Arouca Press is pleased to have published just last year his book, Healing the Culture and the Family According to John Paul II. Dr. Hajduk, thank you for joining us.
It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to focus on the themes of theology in marriage and family?
Sure. Well, it really is very much tied into what the Lord was doing in my life. When I was raised Catholic, and my dad very faithfully raised me a Catholic, particularly teaching me about the faith. I was very blessed to have an older father in the sense that he was well formed. So many of my peers maybe didn't have parents as well formed as my dad was, being older. And that always has been a great grace to me, even when my own story took a turn. I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, of course, and always had a religious leaning and pull, got involved with faith at an early age with my church, got involved in youth group in high school. But you know, the 70s and 80s were the 70s and 80s. So it was like, you know, youth group was huge. All the cool kids were there. It was basically Jesus is your friend, but you can live however you like. Just don't be a jerk. So like that was my general formation when I was in high school. I won't say that it was useless. I think I had some genuine experiences of Christ's presence, so much so that I eventually wanted to study theology in college and got involved in youth ministry as a youth minister myself when I was in college. Even though then I would say I was of a progressive or liberal mind as far as my studies. And truthfully, that was the only stuff that was fed to me anyway, going to school at that time. So I really loved theology, even though, like I said, I was studying more progressive theology. And then I was going to go on to graduate studies, and I was actually going to be going to Fordham for a master's into a PhD program right out of college. And God gave me two great graces in that last semester of my senior year of college. One was that I didn't get the money I wanted for the graduate program, because I think it would have been devastating if I had gone on to Fordham and continued in the theological vein I was in at the time. And the second thing was he brought my wife into my life. So I decided to go and teach high school and continue to work in youth ministry. And my wife and I got married. And when we were expecting our first child, God just really touched our hearts about the pro-life issue. And it just is something that I can't explain. Like, both my wife and I at the exact same time had this overwhelming sense of how evil abortion was, experiencing the pregnancy of our first child. I say experiencing the pregnancy, me remotely, of course. And so you always have to be careful how you talk. It wasn't we experiencing anything. So anyhow, like, that was really profound. Well, right around the same time, now keep in mind, I was a progressively leaning, theology guy. So I knew a lot about Karl Rahner and not a lot about, the documents of the church, because that was the formation. I really didn't have much use for the writings of the popes, because that was also characteristic of the time. So I had never really read a papal document, but John Paul II came out in the spring of 1995 with his encyclical on the gospel of life. And I felt very compelled to go buy this the day it was released, March 25th, the Feast of the Annunciation. And I sat down with it and I thought I should read this. We're getting into pro-life work, and the Pope has come out with this thing on respect life issues. And I read it cover to cover in one sitting. And my Italian side took over, and I wept like a baby after reading it, because it was like, it so profoundly struck me as true. I really did hear the voice of Christ speaking authoritatively in John Paul II, and yet in a way that was so loving and at the same time filled with joy, and yet direct. I was especially even then struck by his analysis of the philosophical underpinnings of the current culture of death. And that always struck me, because my undergraduate degree was both in religious studies or theology. They were just calling all theology religious studies at the time. It was another trendy thing in the 70s and 80s and early 90s, and philosophy. So I had a double major. So I was really struck by those philosophical insights he provided. And I really believed at that point, I knew what it meant that he was the vicar of Christ. So needless to say, I was turned on to his stuff. And so I decided to start gobbling up all the different things that he read. The very next that he wrote, the very next thing that I read was Familiaris Consortio, the role of the Christian family in the modern world, his great apostolic exhortation. And my wife and I, sharing some of that with her, decided very quickly that was going to be the basis of how we developed our family life together. Very, very soon after, so we both jumped in. And I think that next Christmas, my wife bought me a pre-papal work of John Paul II's called Love and Responsibility, which yes. I'm very, very grateful I read that before I came to the theology of the body. I think that's the proper order of things. I think you see the theology of the body very differently when you read Love and Responsibility first. But I read that and was so profoundly struck by that, and then eventually came to the theology of the body. So it was a journey with John Paul II that really was spurred on by this conviction that God gave us about pro-life work and the abortion issue, that not only, I think, my wife had relatively no faith growing up, so it brought her to faith, to Catholicism full in. And for me, who grew up with it, but maybe, for as good as my dad's, all the stuff my dad had given me started to come back to me when I started learning more and more about the faith after all of this. And like, oh yeah, I heard that before. And so it was great. So I had what you would call, I guess, a reversion or a movement from liberal progressive to orthodoxy. And my wife went from pretty much having very little at all to jumping in. We did that together. And these were the teachings that were going to form the basis of our life. So in a way, it became, John Paul II's work became something that really impacted our life, really impacted the way we approached our family, the way we approached life and being open to life. And even how we saw what, the raising of our children was supposed to be and how we were supposed to form them. So I don't know, that's kind of how I came to it. And then being particularly struck by his philosophical analyses, that's what eventually led me to consider so much of what I wound up writing my doctoral thesis on, which then was translated into this book.
Right. Yeah. So in this book, where you're looking particularly at John Paul II's theology of the body, you ask what the philosophical error is at the root of the modern crisis of the family and of culture in general. And you draw on John Paul II's words that it is a type of new Manicheism. Could you explain what exactly he means by that?
Yeah, well, it's a little bit complex. I'll explain directly what he means by that. Um, and then we can maybe draw some relationships to Manichaeism and why he uses that phrase. He uses this, he writes this lovely little quote. I'll share the quote because I think it's an important quote. Within a similar anthropological perspective, the human family is facing the challenge of a new Manichaeism in which body and spirit are put in radical opposition. The body does not receive life from the spirit, and the spirit does not give life to the body. Man thus ceases to live as a person and a subject. Regardless of all intentions and declarations to the contrary, he becomes merely an object. This neo-Manichaean culture has led, for example, to human sexuality being regarded more as an area for manipulation and exploitation than as the basis for that primordial wonder which led Adam on the morning of creation to exclaim before Eve, "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh." This same wonder is echoed in the words of the Song of Solomon. "You have ravished my heart, my sister, my bride. You have ravished my heart with a glance of your eyes." So when I read that, I was struck by this idea of a new Manichaeism and a neo-Manichaean culture. But what particularly interested me was that this little paragraph is nestled within the section of Letter to Families that is his overall critique of Descartes' philosophy and modern rationalism. So there's a relationship he's making between the errors of Cartesian rationalism that we have inherited in our culture since the 17th century down through the Enlightenment and the like, and what he will call this new Manichaeism. So one of the things that I did was I looked at the text itself to try to divide what the main things were in modern rationalism that John Paul II took issue with. And it seemed to me that there's four things. So the first thing is, and it's said in that quote pretty clearly, anthropological dualism. So this understanding of the human person that splits the person into parts, so to speak. So instead of the person being one person that has a body and a soul, a body-soul composite, the person is associated predominantly with his or her mind or consciousness, and not with the body. The body is seen as part of the material cosmos that is used almost instrumentally at the will of the person who happens to, let's say, inhabit it. So Descartes saw man as the thinking thing, not so much as his body. His body was part of a greater cosmic dualism, we could almost say, because the second error of Descartes was this idea of what I would call a mechanistic view of the universe or the cosmos. Basically, what that means is, on the one hand, you have mind, which is the thinking thing, and then everything else is pure extension. So you have res cogitans and res extensa. And so you have the thinking thing, which is the mind, and everything else in the world. And the body is part of everything else that's in the world. Of course, these things immediately cause trouble, because if you're not identified with your body, there's all sorts of things that can spiral off as a result of that. If my body is just something I use, it's not something that I am, well, that becomes problematic. Then it's not, I don't view the body subjectively as my person, because it's united to a soul made to the image and likeness of God, but rather I just view it as matter, pure extension that can be manipulated the way in which I like. Well, the same thing with the world generally. Like, if everything is just matter, then one of the things that resulted from this was that Descartes and all those who sort of went along with the scientific revolution started to see everything in the world as manipulatable by man, so that I can exert my will on matter and created things to make them do what I want them to do, and to use them for the ends I have for them, you see. So in some of that, you could say maybe wasn't all that bad, because some of that led to, the development of technologies and things like this that would wind up making human beings' earthly life better. But there's a more fundamental error, and that is that things in and of themselves don't have meaning, don't have ends for which God made them, but rather I impose my ends, and that's what I can do as a thinking thing. So I impose my ends on creation instead of God writing final cause into creation, you see. And so that's the third thing that the new Manicheism seems to do, is reject Thomas's view of creation, St. Thomas Aquinas' view of creation. What St. John Paul II calls his philosophy of esse, or being. And this is the way John Paul II described it. He said the philosophy of esse, or Thomas's philosophy of being, is basically God as fully self-sufficient being, or ens subsistens, was believed to be the necessary ground for every ens non substens, or ens participatum, that is, of all created being, including man. So the idea that God as ipsum esse subsistens, being itself, that all things are created, are contingent on God's being, right? And receive their being from God, receive their specific essences or nature from God, and that the specific essence or nature they have is that unique creature's way of participating in supreme being who is God. That was commonly understood, as the way to understand creation generally, yet it was summarily rejected by Francis Bacon, Descartes, and the people that followed. And so what you wind up with then is this idea that formal and final cause are out. The only causes that matter are efficient cause and material cause. And so once you know those things, you can manipulate things. But we don't want to have any kind of presuppositions about what things are for. We can make things be for whatever we want.
Right. And then you get the attitude of, if it can be done, there's nothing to prevent it from being done. As technology advances, it advances. If it's possible, you do it.
Right. And I would say, by the way, this is one of the things where I don't know how much you've looked at the correspondence of like the technological revolution, the revolution in the Industrial Revolution, all that sort of thing, and its connection to the Protestant Revolution. But Protestants sort of took a look at creation as, they adopted this view very quickly, because they sort of viewed man's dominion over creation as the fundamental way in which they imaged God. And so therefore manipulating creation to bring about, man's ends was sort of a way of him actualizing himself as the image of God. You see that? But this is not a Catholic view. But it leads to the Protestant work ethic. It leads to all kinds of things with relating to technology and the advancement of society that, dare I say, we're kind of dealing with even economically, like in our culture. So
what would you say is the corresponding Catholic position to that Protestant idea of man being able to manipulate is the way in which he images God?
Yeah, well, I think that, first, the fundamental way in which human beings image God is that they're persons. So in this sense, that we are creatures with a rational nature who have the capacity for love as a result. But love involves willing what is good. And so you need to know the good in order to will it. And God reveals that good even before he reveals himself in Scripture. He reveals that good in creation. And so because human beings are intelligent and God created a world that's intelligible, human beings can know something of God's purposes in nature. This is something that Descartes all out rejected as possible. So one of the things that we'll talk about probably later is that, sex is an easy one to think of in this regard, because it's okay, so what are sexual organs for? Well, it's this amazing thing that even if somebody's never taught it, they wind up figuring it out sooner or later. And no one has to tell them what it's for, and nobody has to tell them in effect what the effect of it is. You learn that too, right? So we can see how God has written into the very nature of sex, for example, that it is by nature supposed to be between a man and a woman for the procreation of children, right? And that specifically we're talking about a husband and a wife because the family is the unit in which welcomes life, right? So this is not rocket science. It's biology, but it's also clear in nature. And so a Catholic would say, okay, so therefore God has written the good right into his creation. And our job now, in order to love rightly, is to will that good that we can know with our intellect. That's something that was rejected along with Thomas's overall notion of creation in philosophy. Really, Descartes and the like really did an all-out assault against any Aristotelian scholastic worldview. And then the last point only is that as a result of that, you wind up with utilitarianism and relativism in ethics, right? So if you're going to reject that there are reasons why God created things and purposes for his creation, then what happens? Well, you decide what those purposes are. You decide what's good and what's evil, what's right and what's wrong. And if you think, well, we can't know what's good and what's evil, you're going to act based on what's most efficient, what brings about the best results, whatever your criterion is for judging best results. So, and I think that was already evident after Descartes, though Descartes doesn't really have a developed moral theory. All the studying I did of Descartes' morals was very much that he saw himself as the ultimate judge of what is and is not true. So while he didn't have a developed moral philosophy, his teaching definitely had an impact on the Enlightenment thinkers that would come after, and then flow from there where relativism and utilitarianism abounded. So,
jumping back though to the Manichees, what is the reference that John Paul II is making to that early church heresy, and specifically what is it about that sect that he connected? Is it the division of body and spirit, or is it particularly their vision of matter as evil, or are those two things sort of inseparable for them?
Yeah, so I think that it's all of that, and I think they are inseparable. Manicheism, which sprung up from Mazdean dualism in the late 3rd century and tried to enter into the terrain of Christianity, was sort of like a syncretistic religion, a blend of Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, and Christianity. But it wound up being very popular. As you know, St. Augustine himself was a Manichaean auditor before his conversion to Christianity. He was attracted to them, and then not very attracted to how unintellectual he found them to be eventually. But he was attracted to the asceticism, I think, of many of the Manichees. The thing is, the reason why I think it entered Christianity, because there was in Christianity a Neoplatonic influence that really emphasized spirit over body and matter.
Mm.
So, and this had already started to happen. The Gnostic heresies, a Manichaeism, you could say, is one of a string of Gnostic heresies. That was already very much around. It may have even been around when John's Gospel was being written, because there are many, you might want to say, not Gnostic influences in John's Gospel, but it looks like John's Gospel is responding to Gnostic things. So that could be possible. And then, of course, the Martianite heresy, actually even held some things that the Manichaeans wound up holding. Like, for example, that because the God that created the physical universe must be the evil God, right? Where the God that created the spiritual is the good God. Since in the Old Testament, we see a God creating the physical universe, that God must be the evil God. And so Martian, for example, dismissed the Old Testament as a result of that. And that was, again, another early Christian heresy, earlier than even Manichaeism. But Manichees adopted a very similar view. Of course, the Manichaean myths and the like, the cosmogenic myths, and they're really very, very interesting. And like bizarre. The physical world is created by acts of like sexual immorality and cannibalism. Like there's
the gods,
and so really what you have is this God of good God, evil God, the God of light, the realm of darkness. If you watched Bionicles growing up, it's very much like that. And then this clash instigated by the Prince of Darkness, which, by the way, interestingly, in Greek was called hyle, or matter. So then all of creation winds up happening as a byproduct of this cosmic battle between the light and the darkness, between this good God and the evil God. And they're trying to outdo one another strategically. And one of the things that the good God does is try to entrap in human beings, as the greatest of creation, the most light elements. But what winds up then happening is the human being becomes the battleground in the war. And the God of the darkness tries to get human beings to fall and to reproduce. So sex is the means of falling, the libido is the means of falling, and reproduction perpetuates the entrapment of the light in the physical universe, and that winds up, being fundamentally evil. So you could see that their view of the physical universe was negative, spirit good, matter bad, physical world bad, and especially with regards to human beings, the body is bad, sexuality is bad, reproduction is especially bad, you see? And so I think that when you take all of these things together, you can see a lot of the analogy that John Paul is making with, I think he's using the term analogously, with these aspects of Cartesian rationalism, a rejection of creation, of God writing his purposes in nature, of creation being fundamentally good, of the body being us, right? Of the body being good, of sex being good, of even a universe. I think in the new Manichaeism, they wouldn't say the physical matter is evil, but they would say that the body and physical matter is value neutral, right? And that therefore you give it value the way in which you use it. So it doesn't go so far as like maybe ancient Manichaeism. It sees creation in terms of its instrumental value. But it's interesting, one of the things that I came across when I studied this was that contemporary scholars of Manichaeism will sometimes dispute this view of Manichaeism as being all negative, and will bring up the fact that matter could become useful as a way of saving the light elements. So if matter had any value, it was an instrumental value in order to release the light elements. So for what it's worth, I deal with a little bit of that in the book, because it made an interesting connection to the mechanistic universe.
Right. And obviously we see a big similarity there with the relativistic view of children being a burden, and therefore contraception being so popular and becoming popularized in the late 50s and 60s. Have you studied Paul VI's Humanae Vitae much? And would you say that his addressing of the question covers all the bases, so to speak, or do you think that he himself is already largely influenced by the modern attitude to the point where he almost accepts the idea that children are a burden, but that they're a burden that just have to be dealt with and accepted as a cross, rather than seeing them as a huge blessing?
Okay. Well, first, let me start by this. I think that you bring up a great point. One of the things that it seems among the Manichees was the case was that there were two classes of Manichees. There was the Manichean elect, who kind of lived by a strict asceticism. I mean, almost so strict that they didn't move, because they felt like if they waved their arms too much, they might harm the light elements in, the particles surrounding them. They were, through their asceticism and through their eating of certain foods, they would actually, it's hysterical that people actually believe that this is okay and true, that they would actually burp, and that would release the light elements from these foods. So the ritual meal became this means of trying to save the light, Now, the Manichean auditors were the second class of Manichees. That's what Augustine was. They provided the ritual meal. So they basically took care of the needs of the Manichean elect. And their hope was that, when you had they really believed in sort of like a transmigration of souls, or rather, maybe better said, a transmigration of the light elements from you into something else, with the idea that the best you could be would be a Manichean elect, and then for sure your light elements in you would be released and you would be freed, right? So you can see where sort of a little Buddhism and that sort of thing plays its way in. Very interesting here. The Manichean auditors didn't have to abide by the strict asceticism of the elect. And it seems that the elect even were a little permissive of the lifestyles of the auditors, especially in the sexual realm. That they grabbed a reputation of being actually quite promiscuous. But the main concern was that no matter what, they couldn't reproduce. So it seemed like indulging their concupiscent desire wasn't an issue, as long as they didn't procreate. And this is why Augustine basically accuses them. He says, you prefer prostitutes to marriage because you spare God that way. And so there was this sort of sexual immorality among the Manichean auditors, and it was very much a contracepted mentality, right? Isolate the physical pleasure from the act. The act has nothing to do with a total gift of oneself or with procreation, right? I think in that there's another similarity that John Paul II was wanting to draw with the way in which contemporary men and women tend to look at the matters of sexuality. Because he talks about sexuality becoming an area of manipulation, right, and use, not of primordial wonder. All right. So that's just setting up the next question. I think I have to say that for whatever faults people may find with Paul VI, and I understand some of the criticisms, this is actually one issue that I thought he was particularly strong. And I don't know what it was, because in so many ways he did not stand up strongly. But with regards to sexual morality, he kind of did. I mean, if you look at even the Second Vatican Council, people were trying to push the birth control issue at the council. And one cardinal, I think it was Suinens at the council, even tried to get it into a document, and Paul VI rebuked him personally about that. He gave some big speech at the council, I think, about contraception and becoming open to birth control. And Paul VI was very angry about it. Paul VI put footnotes into, maybe it was Gaudium et Spes, that specifically cited the church's magisterial teaching on the prohibition against contraception. So like he found ways to get it in there. And he did that almost by papal fiat. Like he asked for these changes to be made. So if I'm right about that, and then think about even Humanae Vitae, in a world in which everything was going in the other direction, the Birth Control Commission suggests that a change should be made. Of the bishops that even choose to respond to his survey about the birth control issue, only 7, I think it was, wind up saying don't change it. The majority say to change it. Of course, 2 of those 7 were Cardinal Karol Wojtyła from Poland and Archbishop Fulton Sheen. So in that sense, you could say that Pope Paul VI had every reason to change it. The world was moving there. The commission told him to. The bishops seemed, even though he consulted them, seemed to be more or less in that direction. And yet he doesn't change it. Right.
Of course,
so
the question is, why is that where all the bishops were? That would be one question. And then the other question also, though, with that is, well, if Paul VI was so sure, why did he feel it necessary to make a commission to study the question? Was that just sort of like saving time? Was that just shilly-shallying? He waited almost a decade from when those bishops at the beginning of the council became very vociferous and insistent on promoting birth control. He waits until 1968 to actually promulgate Humanae Vitae.
Right.
What are the influences at work there, do you think?
Yeah, well, it seems like things typically don't move quickly in Rome until recently. Anyway, I hope that was subtle. Sorry. Well, that's a great question. Actually, John the 23rd, excuse me, still getting over this flu. John the 23rd started the commission, and Paul VI continued it. The question was, I think, specifically about the birth control pill. It was not supposed to be a commission to open up the question of contraception broadly. It was specifically to look at the birth control pill. The birth control pill not being obviously a barrier method. The question was, is this coitus interruptus? So it was new at the time. It was growing in popularity. I think the church felt like it needed to respond. Catholics were going to be, it was going to be available to them. Was this indeed part of the church's prohibition against artificial contraception, or was this different? I think that was the purpose of the commission. Of course, the people who were named to the commission, all of these things, I mean, we even see it today, who's named to what matters a lot. But like, they decided to run with it, opening up the whole question of birth control. And for whatever reason, Paul VI allowed it to continue in that vein. And then after the commission was done, and which was supposed to be just a consulting group for his eyes only, of course, we know the story. Somebody from the commission leaked the majority report. And then that really stirred things up, because everybody thought, oh, a change is certainly coming. And then when Paul VI says no, that's what caused all the big dissent, right? So you have press conferences and all that sort of thing. Yeah, well, you ask a really challenging question. I don't know that I can provide a really great answer, but I would say this: the whole world, I mean, imagine what was going on in the world at this time, right? So like you have the sexual revolution. I mean, that's what's going on. You have the birth control pill. That's what's going on. You have that blending of the feminist movement with the sexual revolution. That's what's going on. You know, you have a general sense of distrust of authority. That's what's going on. You've got like the anti-war movement. You've got the civil rights movement. You got a lot of things going on. And I think that probably a lot of bishops got swept up in that. And they're meeting people who are having difficulties in their marriages, who are feeling very burdened, whatever. And let's give them some credit that their heart is good and they don't want to see people burdened. And that this is, for most of them, not ideological, but out of a misguided mercy. Now,
obviously, of course, the early 60s, you're having marriages falling apart at an unprecedented rate.
Right. And then, of course, in the 70s, you got a more social acceptance of divorce generally. So what winds up being interesting is all the things that Paul VI said would happen as a result of the promulgation of contraception in the culture, in fact, wound up happening. Now, you know, you can say maybe they would have happened anyway, but I don't think so. I think that in that sense, he was looking into the future about what this was going to do, how it was going to change the way we viewed each other, the way men viewed women. Our pornographic culture shouldn't be a surprise. Once you turn a woman into an object by basically removing the procreative aspect from the sexual life of the couple, and therefore really removing the need for any sense of a future commitment. You know, like the idea that the sexual act is an act about the future, not just an act about the now. So in that sense, I think those things like intrinsically are they're like intrinsic dominoes. They just, you know, they kind of, one will lead to the next, to the next, to the next. So I think there was a lot going on. Like, you know, I think it was, unfortunately, I think very misguided. I think if you're going to criticize Paul VI about something, I would say he was devastated by the negative response to Humanae Vitae. I mean, I don't even know that he really wrote anything after that. And
not really. I mean, it was so like shell shocked. He's like, I'm not going to say anything, just in a sense.
And you know what? But this is the thing, is that he missed an opportunity to strongly defend it and to make sure that it was being promulgated among the bishops' conferences, because so many of the bishops' conferences went wishy-washy. They issued their own pastoral statements. Then you had obviously the public dissent. You had this, combined with this, of course, you have this revisionist moral theology that includes a really like wacky view of conscience that the church has never held in its history, such that, you know, people can pretty much decide for themselves that they're going to contracept, even though, you know, something that the church had spoken definitively on, or that was clearly wrong from the natural law, was never a matter of personal conscience.
Right.
So when you have this view of conscience that really comes from people like Karl Rahner, Bernard Herring, and these sorts of guys, simultaneously being taught in seminaries, right, with this revisionist, proportionalistic moral theology, and that's what's really flying through the seminaries in the 70s, you pretty much then have generations of priests trained to think that contraception is a matter of the personal conscience of a couple and has to involve weighing and balancing all the goods and evils in question. And that was never the way the church understood moral theology or conscience or the question of contraception. And yet that's what was going on in the seminaries. That's what was taught to generations of priests. That's what I heard growing up and learning in the 70s and the 80s, and then, you know, in high school and college in the 80s and the 90s. So, I mean, that's everything I thought. So like it was very much just a part of the time. It was the way priests were formed.
Right. So jumping ahead 10 years or so, we're at the end of the 70s, and John Paul II comes on the scene. To what extent is dissent from the teaching of Humanae Vitae still so strong? What is the context that he's coming into, and how does he approach that? Obviously, he'll turn out to be the great pro-life pope of the modern period.
Right. Yeah, well, he inherits a mess, like in so many ways, I think. And he didn't clean up all those messes, and some might say he contributed to some. Um, but in these areas, in respect for life, in sexuality, marriage, and family, I also think in a reassertion of the place of traditional devotions in spiritual life, in the area of classical moral theology and Thomistic thought, because he was clearly a Thomist, even though some people say he was a phenomenologist. He wasn't. So, I mean, I think that he did a lot to help. And he inherited, particularly in the area of Humanae Vitae, a church that everybody just accepted that this was supposed to be a matter of your conscience and didn't take the church's teaching on contraception all that authoritatively. And yet what he decided to do was make his first real teaching project of his Wednesday audiences, because the theology of the body really does start in, the first audiences may have been late 78, may have been like early 79. So very early on in his pontificate, he decides to devote years of Wednesday audiences to male and female. He created them. So like he offers this catechesis as, I think, you have to understand the theology of the body as, and also his other teachings in Familiaris Consortio and the like, letter to families. You have to understand these in the context of like a grand defense of Humanae Vitae. That's how you have to understand them.
Right.
And I think that's indeed what he was doing. Now, of course, my work in my book is trying to show he was trying to do a whole heck of a lot more than just that. Like, so to reduce the theology of the body to that, I think is a mistake. That is definitely what he's coming into, and that's definitely the context. But he's trying to address the philosophical problems that underlie the very thought that contraception could be okay, you see? And so he's trying to go deeper. What is it that we misunderstand about the human person? What is it that we misunderstand about creation? What is it that we misunderstand about the way the good is and our choice of the good is, and how we're really made for the good, for love, for beauty, for the giving of oneself? Like, that if we understand all this, the question of contraception becomes almost untenable.
Right. And it pops into perspective.
Right.
Right. Yeah. So obviously, John Paul II contributes extensively and largely, I think you could say, in a synthesizing role, sort of bringing previous, I mean, obviously natural law, first of all, but then also just all of the church's tradition. He's bringing this and he's synthesizing it in a modern context, and also, taking, like you said, Thomism and putting that, bringing that from before the Enlightenment era and placing it after the Enlightenment era, and seeing how it shines back and disintegrates, how it destroys some of those philosophical errors. How do you tie this to the issues that have really exploded in the last decade or so? Transgenderism, that this is a whole new set of things beyond the sexual revolution. It's like sexual revolution 2.0. Is it the expected result if the body is no longer seen as an expression of the personhood, like you said, in this sort of idea of new Manicheism, and the idea that the mind has total mastery over matter? Is this just a progression of the same thing, or is there a new element at work here?
Yeah. two people that I'll mention who I think their quotes are very insightful. Christopher West said that in a way, transgenderism is Descartes brought to his logical end, because what he said was, Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am," and the current culture says, "I think, therefore I am what I think I am."
Right.
And so, like, that becomes, I think, really telling. Another a great speaker on the theology of the body, a guy by the name of Damon Owens, said in a blurb to a book I had written on the theology of the body for young people. He said this, he goes, "We live in a this is my body, this is not my body world." It's a very interesting and telling statement. You think about the abortion issue, this is my body, right? But then you think about transgenderism, this is not my body, right? So yeah, so I think that this issue of the body being viewed personally and subjectively is at the root of this issue, this problem that we're experiencing today. With now, of course, there's a lot of complexities here. In a way, you know, this can be applied to many different issues. If you think about the abortion issue, what is it that people typically say about an unborn child? Well, it's just a blob of tissue, right? Or it's not a person. And they come up with whatever criteria they have for what makes you a person. And so you can see right there, they're trying to make a distinction between person and body, matter and soul or mind, and using that to evaluate whether or not you actually belong to the category of person, right? So in that sense, you could see with the abortion issue. I mean, if we really believe that we are our bodies, as much as, you know, my heart goes out to people who struggle with infertility. You may know we have a lot of children, so that's never been something that we've struggled with, but we have people that we love very dearly who have. And yet, like, think about the whole current approach to questions of in vitro fertilization and the like, you know, embryonic development in laboratories, and then cryogenically freezing. I think Paris Hilton just bragged that she has 20 boys, meaning that she has 20 boy embryos cryogenically frozen. And I found that striking. In an age when you can't even say you know what it means to be a man or a woman, she says, I have 20 boys cryogenically frozen, referring to her embryos, which seems to personalize them, but then they're like frozen.
And discardable.
And yes, and she's hoping for some girls. So I guess she's going to keep trying until she gets some girl embryos. So like, but this is what I'm saying. This is news that's just, I think, out today. Like, you know, so this kind of lets you know, like, wow, okay. So this whole problem with understanding the body and who we are and what it means to be a person and all these kinds of things, it really does touch all these issues in sexual ethics and bioethics and the like. And yet I think that the issue of transgenderism is particularly one where it becomes very, let's say it resonates loudly, because now you've got people who are denying their bodies, think they have to change their bodies, think they're in the wrong body. You get, like, there's all kinds of things like this. Right.
So, but in continuing with this idea of, right, John Paul II's legacy, I mean, he's a very recent pope, 20 years ago. And yet it doesn't seem like a lot of his assessment has stuck with the ecclesiastical hierarchy. How do you explain that? It hasn't sunk in.
All right, so I have something hopeful to say. Excuse me. One of the hard things about this post-flu cough is that I can't laugh without coughing. It's terrible. I love to laugh. So By the way, Julian, I'm really enjoying this. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you.
Yeah, it hasn't stuck. Well, let me put it this way. Like, the reason why it didn't stuck is because the reason why it didn't stuck, English would help. The reason why it didn't stick is because it wasn't what people wanted. The reaction to it was negative at the time. People did not like his teachings on marriage and the family. They didn't like the fact that he was talking about that pro-life stuff all the time. They didn't want him opening his mouth about this. And they kind of tried as long as they could to pretend that he wasn't saying anything. And the seminaries never caught up either. Remember, the seminaries were teaching proportionalism and moral theology, this new view of conscience. By the way, a great book by Dr. Matthew Levering called The Abuse of Conscience, where he traces these different views of conscience and how John Paul tried to set it right. The problem is, his assessment is that that old view of conscience has made its way back again among the current leaders in the church. That one that was taught in the 70s. Let's just say the guys leading the church were the ones who were schooled then. How's that? So so what you got is that people who basically share a Ronarian view of conscience, who have a proportionalistic or situation ethics kind of view of moral theology, who don't want to burden people, who obviously came out of a time when they were trying to just give peace a chance, and dare I say that had an influence on maybe some of the development of the Reformed liturgy, and all these kinds of things that were going on. So what John Paul II was teaching was not being taught in the seminaries, even while he was Pope. Then what wound up happening is, I think, during the late 80s, maybe early 90s, you start to see a change. You start to see a lot of people who had conversions as a result of the Petrine ministry of John Paul II, who they were really inspired by him. You saw a lot of people who started to adopt and live his teachings in their family life, who experienced great joy. I would count myself and my wife among them, who experienced great joy from doing that, and who began to say, this stuff needs to get out there. Then additionally, think about all the World Youth Days and things like that, right? Then you've got vocations you could say booming after the decline, but the fact is, there were a lot of vocations during the time of John Paul II's reign as Pope. He inspired people to become Pope. And this is, I guess, where, I'm on my more optimistic days, when I'm being less cynical at the way the things are now. I just remember the guys who are in charge today were the guys who were in the seminaries back then, who were imbibing that wrong theology, right? And the guys that are JP2 guys are just coming up.
Right.
So, that we should not despair. Right now it seems as if his legacy was forgotten and not really ever caught by that generation. It was caught by a different generation, and that generation is up and coming. And so right. I have hope for that. Such is also the generation that fell in love with liturgy because of Pope Benedict and his writings, right? So even there's a reason to hope and not despair.
And certainly Benedict XVI was continued in a different note, John Paul II's legacy of orthodoxy and respect for traditional theology, obviously with the emphasis on liturgy.
Yeah, it's very different. If you imagine, for example, when Bill Clinton came, when the Pope came to the United States, and Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton welcomed him. He was very gracious, but he also I mean, you imagine the things that he said while standing right in front of Bill Clinton about America and life. And I mean, John Paul II was not afraid, you know? I mean,
No.
this is a guy who grew up in like Nazi controlled Poland and then Soviet controlled Poland, and was always one step ahead of the communist leadership there when he was Cardinal of Krakow. You know, like
Mhm.
you're not talking about somebody who was afraid, you know? Pope Benedict was a little bit more subdued, you know, like he wasn't as vocal in a prophetic voice, like maybe than as John Paul
Mhm.
II was. But like I remember, like after he visited with President Obama, he gave him the CDF's document on bioethics for some reading. I mean, like, I mean that's a crazy move. That's like, you know, that's like, oh, by the way, you know, here's something I thought you might want to read. You know,
Yeah,
like, you
yeah,
know,
and
and
obviously, Ratzinger himself is sort of a um a product of the seminary, the Vatican II period, and he had some strongly modernist tendencies early on in his career as a theologian, which he then moved away from. So he's an example, yes, a little bit before the formation period of the people in seminary during the reign of John Paul II, but he's sort of an anomaly, and certainly there were people who escaped some of the modernist problems.
yeah,
But
even Henri de Lubac, like, you know, who often by people of a more traditionalist mind uh, gets pointed out. You got to read some of the things that he wrote about what was happening in the church after Vatican II. He was very critical of what was
Mhm,
being done with the council. Um, he's even the one who I think came up with the very phrase that there was a para council. You
yes.
know, like um, so yeah. And then of course you've got great minds like Dietrich von Hildebrand who saw it all too. You know,
Yeah. Where
Louis
would you
Boyer.
place
You know, Louis Boyer
yeah.
saw it too. So I mean, you know,
Where would you place the von Hildebrands in this discussion? Obviously, I mean they're very much in tune with John Paul II, but I know that some people view their writings with a little bit of uh, maybe a little bit of humor, in as much as Alice and Dietrich are very lofty, and they're very spiritualizing of sexuality. And I know Dietrich had children in his first marriage, but not with Alice. And so there's this sense of right, the two ends of marriage being for procreation and union of the spouses. Well, the children weren't there for them, and then the other half gets very much emphasized. Do you have any comments on that?
yeah. Well, I love them. So like, I just think they're great. I don't see them as being. I guess I don't see them as being like hyper spiritual. Um, I actually get the sense that Dietrich was probably quite romantic. I think I get this. You know,
Hmm.
their story is actually quite lovely. Um, but one thing I will say is that sometimes there's contemporary interpretations of the theology of the body that hyper emphasize um, its theology of sex. Um, you know, in one of the things that I think it became a danger in theology of the body circles is that everything became about the theology of the body. You can argue that, like in this book, I'm doing the same thing, but I'm trying to do it in a different way. I'm trying to say that, look, the theology of the body is about a lot more, but it's about a lot more, right? It's about what
Hmm.
John Paul's trying to say and how he's trying to reorient our way of looking at creation, of what it means to be man and woman, of our bodies, of the meaning of life, um, and respond to this anthropological dualism, this reducing of the person to the world, this rejection of Thomas's view of creation, of things being like made for an end or purpose by God, and to kind of dismiss and show as false this relativistic utilitarian culture. actually shows the relativism and utilitarianism is tied in with the fall, which is really interesting. The mutual using of the man and the woman is actually a consequence of the concupiscent heart that's a result of the effect of the fall. That it's really quite beautiful, honestly, when you think about it, that before the fall, the man and woman, in seeing each other's bodies, saw each other's selves, because the body revealed the person made in the image and likeness of God. And so that was the source of the primordial wonder. At last, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. In Hebrew, by the way, there is no body-person distinction. Body is like a word that's used to stand for the whole. So when Jesus says, "This is my body given for you," he doesn't mean just his flesh. He means this is me given for you, right?
Right.
You know, like so when Adam and Eve see each other's bodies, they see each other's whole person, right? What changes after the fall? The reduction of the person to his or her body. And therefore the body seen in a utilitarian fashion as an object of pleasure for me.
Right.
Really powerful, right?
Now you mentioned this sort of emphasis on like theology of the body is about nothing but sex.
Right.
And Rachel Hoover, in a recent article on Catholic World Report on marriage, she comments humorously that, you know, a lot of young Catholics today are going to have been through theology of the body courses or seminars or whatever, you know, 16, 17, 8 years before they'd ever dream of going out with somebody on a date. You know, in a mixed company, whatever. Like, there's, in a sense, there's this sort of disjunct, right? Like, we've got this big focus, obviously very needed, nothing wrong with it, in terms of its theology, on marriage and family and life issues. At the same time, though, with the disintegration of traditional culture, young Catholics today have no common courtship language. There's no cultural norms. Every time somebody starts a relationship, they have to figure things out from ground up again. What is this going to look like? What do I say? What's the expectations here? So it seems like it's also important, as you say, in your book, you're examining John Paul II's deeper, wider philosophical view or vision in the theology of the body. Seems it's also important today to expand things in another direction as well. The idea of general culture between men and women, the courtship, dating culture, and then also in terms of life, the domestic culture, right? All of the other things besides what happens in the marriage bed.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's
all the day-to-day aspects, right?
Yes.
Did you have comment on that?
Yeah. I mean, I think those are some great points. First, a comment about the courtship. I think part of the problem, and I hate to say that this is a problem because immediately I'm going to make myself appear old, but like the fact is that part of the problem is that there are no rules for how a relationship starts. And among young adults, it's really tricky. I mean, like, so we've been texting fairly regularly for a few days. So why don't you call her up and ask her to go on a date? Oh, I can't do that. Why not? Like, you know, like, why can't you do that? Well, that seems like a little quick moving. I'm like, what? You see, like, so and nobody quite knows what that line is. Like, when have we texted enough that I can talk to you in person, or just even to ask you to go out for some pizza? And then on the other hand, it's like, if you're going out for pizza, that doesn't mean that you're in a relationship together. And it doesn't mean that you're going to necessarily get married, you know, like, so I think there's a whole lot of confusion. And part of the confusion is, I think, technological. Like, is that because of how technology has changed and all these social media apps and everything else, you know, what your snap string is and everything else. The fact of the matter is that, like, I don't think people know how to get something started or when it's okay to get something started. And I joke with my older kids about that, and I always say, well, I don't know what the rules are anymore. And they're like, there are no rules. What do you mean the rules? I'm like, oh no, there's definitely rules. There are definitely rules,
Yeah.
But then on the other side, on the other side,
I was just gonna say, so what do you think is too fast? What would be the sort of guidelines you would generally recommend to somebody if they came to you?
Look, I would just say texting is not about a conversation. Texting is about points of fact. So, hey, can I call you later? That's a good use of a text. My wife texting me, hey, honey, we need bread. We're out. Can you pick it up on the way home? Great. We don't have to have a whole conversation about that. I just need to know the task, right? Texting conversations, maybe there's a place for them somewhere. I just think that what winds up happening is, other than your typical, hi, how you doing? It winds up it creates like an ambiguity, that
very, very strange
difficult.
Mental space.
Right.
Yeah, very strange.
So we're
space.
sort of bonding, but we're not bonding. We're kind of getting to know each other, but we don't really know each other. Is this a thing? Is it not a thing? Do I want it to be a thing? Does she want it to be a thing? It's impossible to tell because I don't know what inflection she's using on any of these texts. It's all very complicated. I mean, this is my,
so number one.
By the way, this is my high school teacher, 30 years in Catholic education and youth ministry speaking now. This is not my.
So number one, get rid of the texting. Yeah, I mean, I have a flip phone myself specifically just so that I don't text very much, and so that a phone is just not all that useful to me. I use it to call and text facts basically.
But the problem is a kid's going to tell you, a young adult's going to tell you, but that's what we do. Like, right. So it seems so bizarre to not do that I think for some people that would seem like, oh, I'm being really forward then because you're talking to her like face to face, and yet, man, where have we gone? Where have we gone? So this is funny little story about my wife and me. I met my wife because I was playing and singing in a bar, and she came in with a bunch of her friends to celebrate the end of a term. Just happened to be that the school she was going to was down the road from this bar. Well, she started coming fairly regularly, and I guess I could figure out that she was interested. But I didn't know anything about her, except I knew, one, that her first name was Shannon, two, that she worked at this clothing store in the local mall, and three, that she lived in Ridgewood, which was a town in Bergen County, New Jersey, not far from where I lived. So at the time, because you can't seem too obvious, I had been starting to get really into like gourmet coffee. And I knew that if I was going to start grinding my own beans, I was going to have to get a really good coffee pot with a cone filter that makes the water hot enough to really draw all the flavor out of the beans. So it happened to be that there was a coffee store right across the mall from this clothing store where supposedly she worked. So I'd go to the mall, pick up this $100 coffee pot. By the way, that coffee pot we still have. It's a part of our story now. And then I meander my way across, the mall to the clothing store. I approached the person, she wasn't there. I couldn't see her anywhere. I approached the person at the desk who happened to be, thanks be to God, happened to be somebody that I knew from my high school. So I said to her, hey, how you doing? Good to see you. Have you been good? How you doing? I'm good. Hey, listen, I was looking for this girl. She works here. Her name's Shannon. I know she lives in Ridgewood. And then she said her last name. I said, right. Well, it was so good to see you. I went down the way in the mall to this thing, I know it's going to shock people, called a pay phone. They used to have these in malls. And I picked it up and I dialed 411. 411 in my day growing up was the operator that gave you phone numbers for people. It was like their directory. So
Exactly.
I dialed 411 and I said, the person, give me the number in Ridgewood for their last name. And it was listed. And I got the number and I called the number. Her mother-in-law was on the phone, said, well, she can't talk right now. And I said, okay, well, I'm about 20 minutes from my house, to ask her to call this number in about 20 minutes. She called me and I said, hey, you want to go play pool and grab a cup of coffee? And she was like, great. And so I went to her house, I picked her up, we went out and played pool and had a cup of coffee. And that night was an amazing night. We talked on and on and on, and almost knew immediately. But could you imagine the things that I had to do? Like the ways in which I needed to be creative to even get in touch with this girl? Nowadays I'd be considered a stalker if I just looked at her Facebook page, it would just be so anyway, it's bizarre to me. I did what I needed to do because I knew I wanted to talk to this girl. And if she wasn't interested, she wasn't interested, but it was the way of things. She didn't think anything of it that somebody had asked her out, And yet imagine this generation trying to deal with that. It's and then how long does it take before they even put on their social media, what it is they're calling it? But so what's the other problem? I think there's another problem. And that is that people who are really faithful Catholic kids, who have grown up in faithful Catholic homes, or who have learned the theology of the body and have been turned on to it, they're looking for marriage, which is good. They realize that this relationship is future directed, which is good. The problem is that they get confused because they think if they're dating someone, this has to be the one, and it doesn't. So there's almost like a rush, to have that relationship be the one.
Right, it's yeah.
And then there's a discouragement. There's too much of a discouragement if it winds up that the first few tries doesn't wind up working out. It's funny because all due respect to Catholic Match and things like this, which I think can really be helpful to people to a certain degree. It's like if they have 2 strikeouts, then they're I got to go to Catholic Match, immediately.
Right. And that's what I'm saying is in some circles, at least you get there's clock is ticking, up 21, 22, 23. Ooh, you're getting old,
Right.
And
it's so what? Right. It's okay. Slow down.
Yeah.
But there's this is the middle path. And so if you're asking what I think the middle path is that start out with just being friends with somebody, I think a good relationship blossoms from a good friendship,
Sure.
And that will create its own little awkwardness because when you want to move away from the friend zone, that's its own little, challenging thing. But start at least with friendships. And then if you're interested in somebody, go on a date. It's not wrong to just say, hey, I really get along with you. It seems like we connect. You want to just go get some coffee. We don't even have to call it a date. Let's just go and grab some coffee, talk some more. Let it happen naturally, but also recognize that I think it's true. And I think this is something that John Paul II in the Theology of the Body can help us with, is that God created the male-female relationship for a reason. And that the desires and the feelings he's given us, even if they've been disordered by sin, fundamentally are good and are created by God for a reason, and thus the relationship you have as a boyfriend, girlfriend, courting, whatever people are going to call it, has to be intentional and principled. So right. You've got to go about it in a way where you're really trying to discover, is this person the one that God is calling me to marry? Are they the one for me? And so you should take time to learn about each other and learn about all those important things about each other that you would want to know about the person you are going to marry. And get to know them and their family, because you marry a family. So get to see them in the context of their family, see them in the context of their friends. Really try to learn about who this person is. And then you'll know if they're the one, you'd like to continue, in a direction with or not. But it has to also be principled. And that means that you got to go about guarding one another's purity. Because so you have to be in settings, I think, that are public. I think that you need to be careful about avoiding occasions of sin. Because if you are growing closer and you are experiencing some bonding in that relationship, well, then your sexual desire, of course, is going to grow too. And you need to understand that there's a place for that and a time for that, and do your best to guard one another's purity, to keep yourself both out of circumstances that are going to lead you to do things that are against God's plan for you and against your good, really.
Mm-hmm.
How do you like that? Is that okay?
That's pretty great. That's good. I especially like the hold off on texting message. All right, Dr. Hajduk, thank you so much for this interview. Besides Waitiwa's Love and Responsibility, are there any other books that you'd recommend for our listeners if they want to delve into these topics a little more?
Yeah, actually, especially if you're interested in how a lot of these same challenges impact our culture today. There's been some great books, like Carrie Gress has a great book called The Anti-Mary Exposed. If you're curious about, again, the philosophical underpinnings of a lot of what's gone on since the sexual revolution and the like, that's really good. There's a book by not a Catholic, believe it or not. His name is Carl Trueman. He teaches at Grove City College in Grove City, Pennsylvania. He's a co-editor of First Things, a contributing editor of First Things. And he wrote a book called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, which I think is really important if for anybody who's trying to understand how we can even live in a world where somebody could say, I'm a woman trapped in a man's body. Like, that to my father is an unintelligible statement, right? What does that even mean? He would be like, but today people just, people on the street who don't even have college degrees sort of just accept that could be a thing, right?
Right.
So how do we get to a world in which even your neighbor, somebody would say that and they wouldn't look quizzically and perplexed at that statement? Trueman does a great job. I don't think he strikes all the notes. He starts with Rousseau, so he actually bypasses Descartes, just gives him a little bit of a mention. But he does hit a lot of the notes. And he talks about Freud and Marx and Nietzsche. And I think that those are three main thinkers that we need to give some more thought to, their influence on our contemporary way of seeing. And they're all inheritors of, Descartes and the Enlightenment thinking. So
sounds like material for a second interview.
Hey, I'm all good. I'm working on that book though. I have a book I'm researching now that the working title is Not of the Father, and the subtitle is The Masters of Suspicion and the Threefold Lust, where John Paul II, in one of his audiences in the Theology of the Body, actually just briefly mentions that Freud, Nietzsche, and Marx, who Paul Ricoeur, the philosopher Paul Ricoeur, called the masters of suspicion, and who developed the hermeneutics of suspicion. Basically, John Paul said they can each be associated with one of the threefold lust. So Freud is associated with the lust of the flesh, Marx with the lust of the eyes, and Nietzsche with the pride of life. And yet that's all he says. He kind of makes this interesting passing comment, and then he leaves it alone. I have been obsessed with this idea. I just think that there's so much in this right now. So I want to talk about how the first master of suspicion was Satan in the garden, you know, and talk all about the masters of suspicion, really dive in to what Freud, Nietzsche, and Marx said, to how they're connected to the threefold lust, and then what is the Christian response.
Sure. And that will be with Arouca Press, correct?
Yeah. We'll see what Alex is game for.
Yeah, awesome. Awesome. Thank you very much for sharing all of this, Dr. Hajduk, and we'll see you next time at the 4th episode of Signposts.
Excellent.